The Reclaimer, it's a salvage ship that's used for going out and scavenging. It reclaims ships that have been damaged or destroyed because it has a giant claw underneath that's got lasers on, and it cuts up the material and all gets sucked in through a vacuum inside, which can then get processed. It's got a drone bay at the top of it, so it's got these hatches that will open out, and you just have player controlled drones that will fly out from there, which can then go to help salvage parts of the ships.
I would expect it. The Reclaimers. So you and your friend might get intel on where the latest conflicts happened, and you rock up, and the ship's fairly tough, but it's not a combat ship, so it can probably go in fairly aggressive space. But then when it gets there, its role is effectively just to clear up. It's like a giant space hoover, is the idea, yeah. And I expect people will have fun just hunting and exploring, looking for things that have salvage value in the universe.
The Reclaimer is very industrial and kind of rugged feeling. So it's an Aegis ship, and we take a lot of cues and art styles from other Aegis ships, but we've remixed it, I guess you could say. So we looked at a lot of industrial spaces, like old factories or old kind of steel mills, that kind of thing. And we also drew a lot of inspiration from like Alien, from the Nostromo. So you'll see a lot of cues to the Nostromo in there. That kind of built the style of the Reclaimer. So yeah, it's a bit more rugged and industrial, and you'll notice it feels a little bit more lived in, a little bit less clinical than some of the other ships. It was good fun, just trying to work out that whole system of how it goes from floating around in space to being processed and passed into the ship and then stored inside the ship somewhere in a way that actually makes sense from point A to point B. That was quite a challenge, but it's quite a fun thing to work on. Kind of excited to see it actually working in its final form as well.
The actual arm itself is player controlled, though, the big claw. That person sits next to the pilot in the bridge, and from the bridge, it's all glass windows everywhere, and you just see the arm shooting out underneath, and that's how the player controls it. They just see it and eyeball it, so it's quite impressive. We've got seats at the side that the player gets into, and then it's just like a little mini cockpit. But the actual barrel, they're in like a barrel, and it rotates while they're in it. So while the turrets are moving up and down, those seats will rotate dependent on what they're pointing at. So when everything is moving and working, you just see these players either side of you spinning, and there's smoke going off everywhere. It's really cool.
When I started on the Reclaimer, the first room that I blocked out was the escape pod room. And we used this room to kind of get across the feeling we wanted to kind of carry through on the rest of the rooms we worked on the ship. So we took that and we pushed it all the way to final as one of the first assets on board the ship. And it's full of machinery and pipes, cabling and greebles, and the lighting's kind of cold and atmospheric and dusty, and you should feel the machinery whirring. And then after I'd finished that space, I worked on the connecting corridors, which is this step down stairway where you can look through down to the processing room. Obviously, when I was working on this space, the processing room wasn't complete, so it was just a void. But now you should be able to walk down, and below you'll have the refinery process, and you might see metal and things whirring. After the stairwell, you head down into the tech corridors. The tech corridors are the space that is designated for the computer systems and the servers and basically all the plumbing and wiring for the center of the ship. And this is very much the core where all the kind of systems and machinery are controlled from. And from there, you have the central drone room. We have 3 drones that are able to be player controlled in order to go out and collect salvage and bring it back to the Reclaimer's machines and process. And from there you have 2 control booths and the racks and mechanisms for maintaining your drones and repairing them and keeping them all in order. I suppose they're designed to feel quite cold and industrial, but I've left kind of little kind of comfy corners in places so that it feels kind of cozy. Like the control booth has got 2 big comfy chairs and it's quite isolated, and then you go out into the actual drone room and it's quite open and and exposed. And it's the same with other areas on the ship. It's supposed to be kind of like a big nest, effectively. And you might find a little area where you can kind of drop down, have your cup of coffee or whatever, and then back to it.
The first room that I worked on was the processing room, which is kind of like the trash compactor from Star Wars, but we've thrown in big, huge spinning blades in there as well, just to help crush it up. So it's basically a big, noisy room that's really sweaty and grimy, and it's just got huge blades spinning, churning metal up. It was actually really fun to work from because it was one of the few pieces of interior work that we had concept for. So it was nice to see somebody's interpretation of it and then just put your own spin on it. It's got a huge door at the back where all the scrap metal gets processed through. And it's cool seeing all the lights spinning off and then that door opening up. And it's filthy.
There are some creature comforts in the ship. It's not all an industrial workspace. So the area that I was working on specifically was the habitation area for all the crew and the captain. So you will see more kind of softer elements. So you'll see lots of padding on the walls. The crew have their own sleeping area and, you know, their own bathroom, their own kind of chill out area as well. So it's not all industrial, but we tried to break the ship down into zones. So you have a habitation area, a technical area and engineering areas, and all of them are kind of quite distinct. And that also actually helps the player with signposting throughout the ship. So I know a criticism of previous ships was that people would find it very hard to navigate around in them. So that's something that we tried to fix from the very beginning, in that the layout made sense and you could find your way around without getting lost.
I worked on the engineering deck as well. That's where the engine's power comes from. That's another sweaty area full of chains, and drew a lot of inspiration from Alien, the Nostromo in this. The whole ship really is very Nostromo themed. But yeah, that room's got this floating there's a floating walkway through this room, and it circles around the engine component, and it just feels it's full of smoke and fog.
I think my favourite bits have been the kind of smaller rooms, like the little kind of spaces that wouldn't normally have that much attention, but I've gone and put a little bit more effort into those areas because I think it's quite cool for the context of the ship to have like almost the little things like the broom cupboard are totally filled out with detail and little monitors and machines, and you'll probably hear whirring and tinkering as you go in there, and everything kind of looks like it's got a function and a kind of reason behind it.
There's a captain's quarters where he's separated from everyone else with his own little office and bedroom and very swanky. And across the way from him, you've got the crew quarters, which holds 6 people. They've got their own bathroom. And then there's a mess hall as well, which again is very similar to the one from Alien, where it's just a table that curves around and people just sit around it, and it's sunk into the floor a little bit.
While I also did the habitation area, I also did the cockpit. And the cockpits are easily the most challenging area of the ships. The rest of the ship is kind of simple in a way. As soon as you get to the cockpit, there's so many different systems and departments that become dependent on each other in a very small area. So getting the cockpit right was probably one of the biggest challenges, but also one of the things I'm most proud of that I worked on the ship. The challenges are basically making sure that the player has good visibility from the cockpit windows, making sure that the enter and exit animations work correctly with animation sets that we already have, so we don't have to make new ones, setting up the whole dashboard so that you have all the UI there and it's all readable and legible on screen and laid out in a way that makes sense. So there's a lot of elements come together in a very small space.
A lot of the challenge with the ships with Aegis in general is that we have a lot of running curves and shapes that are kind of consistent. They carefully run into one another and meet up neatly, and this kind of makes the art kind of feel quite cohesive. But it does mean that when you're working with assets that connect together in like a modular sort of fashion, you have to make sure that this piece will connect onto all the other pieces and be reusable, but yet you want all the edges and lines to kind of connect up neatly together. And some of the spaces in the Reclaimer are a little bit awkward in some respects, so it's a bit of a challenge getting all the modular pieces to connect together nicely.
Working on the Reclaimer was the most fun ship that I've worked on so far, definitely. We've got our pipeline to a point now where everyone knows what they're doing. They know what the the quality standards are. And now it's at a point where there's not really many question marks when we start on a ship, unless there's a new gameplay mechanic in there that we haven't looked at before. So it's just a case of just making really cool artwork. And in the past, you know, some of the ships, the layout might have caused issues for the player. So once we knew that we had the layout right, we knew exactly how we were going to approach the art, and just making it was good fun, really. I think everyone who worked on the ship really enjoyed it from an art perspective.